Pressure is a fairly common ability in older generations, especially since nearly every legendary Pokemon used to exclusively get this ability. Thankfully, while some modern legendaries still actually get the ability though, since Generation 5, very few legendaries have actually gotten Pressure and instead are getting far more creative abilities. That's not to say that Pressure never has a place on a Pokemon, even some of these older Pokemon, as Pressure is actually a pretty strong ability if you're playing for a long match. But because of the fact that this was kind of just slapped onto Pokemon, I want to try and see if we can come up with some better abilities for these Pressure Pokemon. For the sake of today's video, we're only going to be discussing the Generation 1 through 4 legendaries, since both Kyurem and Eternatus ended up getting this ability exclusively in their trios, and none of the other Pokemon did, not even their alternate form. So it feels a lot more intentional here, whereas the Gen 1 through 4 Pokemon, on the other hand, this feels a lot more just slapped on. Meanwhile, most of the Generation 1 through 4 legendaries ended up just getting this ability thrown on, and it really doesn't offer them anything. If you guys disagree with my suggestions in any way, shape, or form, I'd love to hear about them in the comments below, but I feel pretty confident that I've come up with the best list possible today, and I'm sure you guys will enjoy it. While you're on your way down there though, make sure to leave a like and subscribe for more, and consider becoming a member as well if you want to go the extra mile and support the channel for just a couple dollars a month. With that said though, let's start off with the Kanto birds. Generation 1, we have a total of 4 legendaries that got stuck with Pressure. 3 of them are the Kanto birds. Seeing as these Pokemon all share the flying typing as their secondary type, I figured we should try and pull some cool abilities from the flying type pool of Pokemon, as there are a lot of cool options, and the ones with the primary typings of electric, ice, and fire just didn't really seem to fit. Starting off with Articuno, I opted for Serene Grace, which I actually got the idea from looking at Togekiss. In Generation 9, we've seen Articuno typically going for movesets with Snow Warning plus Blizzard in order to try and take advantage of these dual freezes with the really strong 100% accurate Blizzard and Snow. I figured this new ability of Serene Grace though could actually be a good way to just increase Articuno's chances of being relevant outside of Snow, and it still keeps the same intention in mind when it comes to using the Pokemon. On top of this, even outside of just Blizzard specifically being spammed, this also helps out with single target moves like Ice Beam, which would be a lot more reliable than Blizzard outside of the weather, or even just Air Slash becoming a viable option finally. I do think Blizzard will still be the most used choice on Articuno, and it will still play on a lot of the same teams that it is because Snow is just such a good benefit to Articuno, but at the same time though, I do think it's at least a nice option that could in theory take the alternative spot from Snow Warning here. I think Zapdos was a bit tricky, but I ultimately ended up opting for Kilowattrel's signature ability of Wind Power. I think Static's always going to be the better fit in a Pokemon as well-rounded stat-wise as Zapdos, but Wind Power at least does give Zapdos a little bit of merit as an offensive Tailwind option. I think at the very least this gives Zapdos a means of actually dealing some really strong electric damage and keeping up with a lot of other common Pokemon in the format, since this also would just allow for Tailwind setting Zapdos to finally have a place and deal some serious damage with moves like Thunder and Thunderbolt. I think this ability also fits Zapdos' origins pretty well because its very first encounter is in Kanto's Power Plant, and while other electric immune abilities such as Lightning Rod, Volt Absorb, and Motor Drive all fit, I do think there are other options that typically would use these abilities better, and I think that honestly Wind Power probably just fits the best. Moltres is a really difficult one, and I even contemplated just trying to keep pressure on Moltres as I do think it kind of fits. Looking at its move pool, it definitely reminded me of another flying type Pokemon that decides to miss its moves rather often, and I decided that Moltres could actually benefit really well from using the ability No Guard. Having a 100% accurate Stab, Hurricane, and Heat Wave that aren't really weather dependent in Hurricane's case could be a really strong option for Moltres. Considering Hurricane typically goes down to 50% accuracy when the sun's up, this could give Moltres a lot of value as a really good fire and flying type that can not only avoid missing Heat Waves, but isn't really harmed by the sun being up to boost that damage. While you can very easily KO Moltres now with a 100% accurate Rock Slide, there's a lot of good wide guard options like Mienshao and Hitmontop that really do fit the tier well right now, and you could definitely force options like Stone Edge having to be ran on Pokemon, which is going to be a lot less reliable against anything that's not Moltres. So I think this would at least find some sort of relevance to the tier while not really getting rid of any common synergy Moltres would have as a Tailwind setter. Among the restricted legendary Pokemon, Mewtwo was probably the most difficult to find an ability that would actually make it good. I think there's a couple different ways that we can make Mewtwo work both thematically while also giving an ability that might actually keep up with the format. The first one's going to be Protean, which I think actually leans into the type changing aspect that would be really good with a genetic Pokemon like Mewtwo. Considering this is a clone around Mew, which is a literal pun on the word mutation, we could definitely call the ability literally mutation, but with the first MU spelled like MEW, and have it be a really good option for the Pokemon referencing its origin. For another ability that could maybe benefit Mewtwo, a new option like Neuroforce that was previously on Ultra Necrozma that's no longer in the game could be a cool choice. While this ability doesn't really help it keep up with the likes of Calyrex and VGC, there's not really a lot of abilities that would, and at the very least, this ability is still a pretty good one nonetheless to help just Mewtwo getting a really good neutral damage boost, and with its wide coverage options, I think that 1.2 boost would go a long way in terms of finding super effective hits. We need to otherwise create some absolutely absurd ability set, because even an ability as broken as As1 would never actually give Mewtwo a place in VGC, as Calyrex would always just be objectively better. We can finally move on to Johto, which has some pretty good options. Starting off with Entei, we have a pretty clear winner for an ability though, and I feel like the best choice is going to be Scrappy. Scrappy still provides a really good immune to intimidate ability, but instead of giving you a way to avoid flinching with options like Fake Out, you would instead be able to hit ghost types with your extreme speed now. I think this ability will definitely still be less valuable on Entei, especially after Generation 9 where you can no longer go for Terra Normal to boost its damage output, but I think it at least keeps up with the reason you'd use Entei currently, and I don't really think it needs any other abilities outside of maybe some sort of fire type version of Aerially, but at the same time though, I feel like it's just not going to thematically fit Entei as well. Suicune probably I think is the best abuser of pressure among anything on the list today, but I still did want to try and give it something that would still defensively benefit. Typically when you're using pressure on Suicune, it's for those Calm Mind Rest Talk Suicune sets, and Suicune does really appreciate this ability on those, as it's a really good way to actually allow Suicune to bring Pokemon to timer. But what other ability could apply a similar level of defensive pressure here? I think our best bet would actually be Stamina, and I think this would help Suicune's viability increase significantly in VGC again. Stamina would provide Suicune with a 1.5 boost to physical defense anytime you take an attack, and this would allow you moves like Snarl and Calm Mind that can help Suicune taking on the special attackers more easily, while you have Stamina to boost your defensive stats for any physical threats. I think this would give Suicune a true place in the format again as a really good focal point defensive piece alongside Pokemon like Amoonguss, and with Stamina, you could definitely partner this with a really good Intimidate Pokemon such as Incineroar or Lando T, and with the move Scald and Suicune, you're kind of going to be basically untouchable. I think Raikou is going to be in a pretty similar boat to Mewtwo, where I don't really think any ability we give it, or just any relevance in the format that could be gained from a new ability, will end up mattering here. I think realistically a lot of other electric types just end up benefiting the format better, and typically the ones that do the best either are way faster than Raikou, or they have an immunity to ground type attacks like Earthquake. I think because of this though, I'm gonna just lean into Mold Breaker for Raikou, as I think this at least gives it some sort of niche around Lightning Rod Pokemon. I think at minimum this allows Raikou a place on any teams that are really weak to Kyogre or any Rain in general, allowing you just a really good electric type move that can also partner with options like Snarl to just defensively benefit your team. I think realistically the only niche that Raikou actually would have would be avoiding these Lightning Rod Pokemon, so I think that any ability outside of Mold Breaker here just wouldn't really work. But Inner Focus is still a cool option too on any sort of support build for Raikou that typically would bank on screen sets or Snarl spamming, though Mold Breaker I think at least could be a cool addition. Ho is going to be the first Pokemon that we've really leaned into that completely new ability concept for it, and I think that I actually found one that fits really well off the Generation 9 mechanics. I think for Ho, we're going to take a spin on the Revival Blessing concept, considering it is a Phoenix-style Pokemon. And on a Pokemon as bulky as Ho, this ability would be pretty nuts. However, considering Ho is supposed to be your team's ace, and it still has to contend with options like Groudon, Kyogre, and Miraidon that all severely pressure this Pokemon for an instant KO, I think there's at least some merit to giving Ho at least an ability to justify it being on the field if you are going to go that route. I do think at the very least though, we should only make this ability target the Pokemon that faints next to Ho for the very first time it procs, as I think otherwise you're going to end up getting a Ho that's going to be able to just pick any Pokemon to revive, and that can definitely get out of hand very quickly. In a double restricted format, this could make Ho-Oh into a really good support Pokemon on teams that would also be able to be a bulky Tailwind setter, and I think next to Pokemon like Kyogre and Rayquaza, you could get a lot of merit out of this. So it still is something that you need to be very careful when positioning. Lugia's ability was difficult to really place here solely because Ho-Oh's ability was such a cool, unique idea. Unlike Ho-Oh, I think we already have the perfect ability and multi-scale for it, so I don't really see what else I could actually give Lugia, but if I had to pick, I think we need to find an ability that's going to really justify Lugia existing on the field, because it is probably one of, if not the very worst restricted Pokemon of all time. Because of this, I feel like an Armortail reskin that's more tailored towards Lugia specifically could be a really good choice here. While I'm unsure what the name for the ability could be, I feel like at the very least this justifies Lugia being just a really good bulky Pokemon without much offense, since it can kind of just exist on a team at any given point and utilize moves like Tailwind while blocking any incoming priority taunt, which is the most common form of taunt. This essentially allows it to compete as the Tailwind equivalent of what Ferrograph does currently in VGC, and I feel like you might at least get it some play at this point in the format, even though it still would typically be dead weight against any team without a priority move. At the very least though, you would finally have a reason for Lugia to want to exist on the field outside of multi-skill, so I think that's at least something for it. Hoenn thankfully only gave us one legendary Pokemon with pressure, but it does have 4 different forms, being Deoxys, which is a pretty cool option, though never really typically allowed in VGC. I do still want to give it at least some sort of ability, and while I do think there are a lot of options on a Pokemon like this, such as Regenerator, Multi-Scale, Neuroforce, Psychic Surge, etc., At the same time, I don't really think there's any one existing ability that fits every form correctly. Because of this, I think the best choice would be giving it an ability that functions pretty similar like Download or Dauntless Shield, where the first time you switch in, Deoxys' highest stat just gets a +1 boost. I think we could probably call it something like DNA manipulation, where Deoxys switches in on the field and whatever stat has the highest points, you end up getting a +1 boost to that. At the very least, if this form is ever legal, Deoxys' attack could genuinely have a reason to at least be a strong physical spammer, with options like extreme speed on a really good physical set, or even just using a special attack boosting set to increase your expanding force damage, making it a really good fast option that would have a presence over Calyrex Shadow at least. Seeing as the biggest reason not to use Deoxys right now would be Calyrex existing, at the very least I think this is a cool way to give Deoxys some actual usage in the format, even if it would still have some downsides such as its offensive form having paper thin defenses. Generation 4 had some pretty interesting box office picks, and after Generation 3's Weather Trio, I was really hoping that we got some exclusive abilities here. I won't act like they all don't fit the identity of having the pressure ability well, but at the same time, there was a lot of room to work with. Starting off with Dialga, I think the perfect modern fit here would be Filter. Dialga's body being coated in steel would fit perfectly for this, and it helps a lot with Dialga having a really good defensive typing that has a lot of neutrality to it. With options like Fighting Your Ground now becoming at least a little bit less super effective on Dialga, this would help it a lot as a really good Trick Room tank that could still fire off some massive damage with its wide coverage pool. With Terra too, this could have made Dialga a very threatening option, as with Filter you could really tailor the abilities to fit your team the best. And with Telepathy sets especially being good next to Ursaluna, you could have had fun with both of its abilities. Since we gave Dialga a little bit more of a defensive ability here, I'm going to lean towards a more offensive ability that would benefit Palkia just due to its sheer coverage. Because of this, I'm thinking we're going to give Palkia the ability Sheer Force. And I think with a Pokemon that has coverage like Flamethrower, Thunderbolt, and Earth Power, as well as its incredible dual stabs, this would genuinely be a perfect fit. Considering your coverage pool is at least about as practically wide as options like Mew and Nidoking would be, Sheer Force coming off of a Pokemon with 150 special attack would actually give Palkia a really good reason to be used in modern formats. While I don't exactly think that its speed would really help it here too much, at the same time, on a good Tailwind team, or even just using it as a good bulky Trick Room option, you could definitely at least make Palkia have some sort of presence here, though it still has some issues that I think would at least make it so it's at least a balanced pick here. To round out our legendaries we'll be fixing, let's talk about the very worst restricted Pokemon of all time, and you could argue as far as doubles, it might just be one of the worst Pokemon you could use, Giratina. We're strictly talking about the base form here, as the origin form has not only Levitate, but also just some actual relevance due to the fact that with Terra and Levitate, you could actually make it viable. Giratina's base form, however, has none of these actual benefits. And while it has a lot of the same issues that Lugia does, at least Lugia has a slightly better support move pool, and it also at least has a slightly better speed stat. Giratina also overlaps with a lot of other common restricted typings, so there's not even really a reason to actually find a Giratina use on your team because any other dragon type will do better. Despite having two really good immunities to normal and fighting, being weak to some of the best types in the format like Ghost, Dragon, Fairy, and Ice, as well as many others, does at least take a pretty big toll on Giratina. Because of all the downsides that Giratina does have in the format, I don't really feel bad about giving this a broken ability. And I think the ability that is going to be our choice here fits it so perfectly that it would really be a crime to not actually pick this. I'm going to give Giratina the ability Shadow Tag, and I think this would at least give Giratina, as well as defensive playstyles and restricted formats in general, an actual way to be viable. For starters, with the Shadow Tag Giratina, you could actually make Parashop teams work really well again in a restricted format. And considering we don't have a way to actually viably do this outside of Gothitelle, which is very finicky to say the least, this could actually be a really good place for Giratina to currently exist and have a merit to be used in VGC. On top of this as well, Giratina itself would be immune to its own Shadow Tag, since it is a Ghost type, so you would at least have some way to shuffle it in and out, even if your opponent used a Pokemon like Ditto to really copy this. I think because of the fact that Giratina's Ghost and Dragon type would be held back against the Bikes and Zacian, you would still need to at least force a Terra onto Giratina with Terra Ghost, or just get really lucky with Protect turns to at least keep it on the field long enough. But with this in mind, you could at least viably get Giratina to burn enemies like Koraidon and Zacian, or even just to set up a Calm Mind in front of Miraidon more easily without dying to Draco. We also just have plenty of good wall breakers like Calyrex Shadow that would be still very difficult to take on, so Giratina still has a lot of issues that would come up in a format like this, but I think it finally at least gives you a reason to want to consider using Giratina on a team. And despite the ability being so broken on a defensive Pokemon like this, there's a lot of really easy ways to kill Giratina anyway right now, so I just don't think it's going to be a huge issue. If you guys have any other suggestions on how we can buff these pressure Pokemon, make sure to comment them down below, as I'd love to hear all your guys' ideas. While you're on the way down there, make sure to hit the subscribe button, as I upload more content like this every week, where I discuss a lot of different ways to either improve Pokemon in VGC, or just a lot of different more nuanced VGC concepts. Also, in case you've already supported the channel by doing liking, commenting, and subscribing, if you want to go the extra way with your money and donate a little bit, the memberships down below are also a great way to show support, and that money just goes towards paying the editors a bit more so they can put on amazing content for you like this. With that said, I'll see you guys later. Until then, peace out, guys.